Time for me to tell you about me and Frank Bogage. This is an unlikely story. We met long before we met. I got a job at a place called DataPro, which was all about documenting everything that was going on in the computer industry during the microprocessor explosion. And I stood out a little bit, and everywhere I went, people kept telling me about this guy named Frank Bogage, who was the the guy that everybody knew was a genius, who had left DataPro to go to NCR. So every time I did something worthwhile, people would say, well, Frank Bogage. And then actually I got contacted by a headhunter who knew Frank Bogage, and I got myself a job at NCR. And part of the reason I went was I wanted to meet this genius, this Frank Bogage. Who the hell was he? What was he? So I accepted the job. I moved out to Dayton, Ohio, which was actually a good move on my part, personally and professionally and every other way. Big jump in salary and all that sort of stuff. And so I am in my cubicle on the very first day, and this guy shows up at the door of my cube, and he says, Robert Laird? And I said, yes. And he says, I'm Frank Bogage. He said, I've heard a lot about you. And I'm looking at him, and it's not challenging. In fact, it's like happy, expected. It's like he is looking forward to knowing me. So on that very first day, we go out to lunch together, which is when I got to tell him that I'd heard a lot about him too, and he brushed all that aside. He said, "I have, I am the low man on the totem pole here." He said, "So get used to that." He said, "You probably don't even want to be seen with me." And I said, "Well, I don't care about that." We were both from New Jersey, and we're in Ohio, and Ohio and New Jersey don't actually mix very well. So Frank very rapidly became my mentor. I thought I had learned a lot about the computer industry when I was at DataPro. We used to stand in the aisles talking about who was going to dominate IBM or AT&T, or we talked about digital equipment and Sperry and all these other contenders, and rated their chances, and none of us had the slightest idea about how anything worked in the actual corporate world. And truth to tell, it's we watched, we studied the products, but we didn't actually know that much about how they worked. Frank filled in all of those gaps for me. He taught me. I mean, he was the guy who had been in the garage, soldering the circuit boards. He knew exactly how the stuff worked, and he knew how the corporate thing worked. So he gave me a 6-month to a year advantage simply by showing up on my cube at the first day. And he was never anything but supportive. He was a perfect friend. We were looking at a situation of a division that had no idea what business it was in, a company that had no idea what business it was in. And they had gotten tired of Frank telling them this, because he was right. And they all knew he was right, but they didn't want to hear it. So what they did was they created this thing called the Executive Briefing Program, and they sent Frank on the road permanently. he went and he talked to top executives where NCR was in the top 2 or 3 qualified vendors lists, and he would explain to them all the terrible failures of the IBM PC network approach. And he was brilliant. Everybody knew he was brilliant. And the thing was, you could actually see people turn off because they knew he was right and they didn't want to hear it. But I did my thing, which was to write, to actually analyze things. And within 2 weeks of arriving at NCR as a competitive analyst, I wrote a memo to the director of marketing explaining that the problem with our division was that we didn't actually have a marketing strategy. Which Frank read, and he said, yeah, go ahead, send it. Because Frank was fearless, and we both got called on the carpet and grilled by the director of marketing. And then at the end of it, he said, okay, he said, I probably should discipline both of you for going over the heads of your respective managers, but actually, this is the new marketing strategy of the NCR Office Systems Division. Afterwards, this guy kept calling me Strategy Man. And that's when my career actually started to rise. I mean, they didn't promote me or anything, but every time something actually needed to be done, this guy came to me. And he said, okay, I need something done, do it. Meanwhile, Frank is teaching me about computers, how they actually work. What is the difference between the product we were selling and what IBM was selling in terms that we'd never gone into at DataPro. He taught me what the different microprocessors could do. He taught me why our product was in fact technologically superior to everybody else's. And he also taught me why the division was on a collision course with disaster. Now you have to remember that my whole career is basically founded on what I learned at NCR, where I was only there for a year and 5 months. That was the extent of Frank's and my experience with each other. But by the end of that year and 5 months, we wound up spending a 36-hour day trying to save the division from annihilation. NCR had committed itself to a product that it could not possibly deliver, and they were planning to release it as a product for the general market, and Frank knew that it would kill the division instantaneously and create lawsuits in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So we prepared our case. We flew down to our development facility in Columbia, South Carolina, and the two of us stood up against the entire arrayed force of the NCR Office Systems Division and told them that it was all junk, that they couldn't do it. And we lost. By this time, of course, Frank and I were notorious. We were called the Blues Brothers because we had our dark suits and we had our dark scowls because we were the only ones who were carrying the flag for the division. Everybody else was doing their job, you know. And when it was over, we knew the division was done. And there's another whole story about what happened after that, because I wasn't able to turn it all off and go home, which Frank knew enough to do. I didn't, because I was young and I was stupid. But that's another story. What I will leave you with is an image of Frank. We had both gone down to Columbia, South Carolina for another fruitless meeting with the developers, who were all dumb as hell. And we were staying at one of these hotels with an open courtyard and an elevator that you could like see into glass. And here he comes down in the elevator. I'm waiting for him at breakfast. And here he comes, and I swear to God, he looked exactly like Napoleon Bonaparte. And that's who I always think of him as. Frank Bogage was Napoleon in technology.